Okay, everybody, it is straight up 1 o'clock. So I think we should probably go ahead and get started. I would anticipate that some other folks are probably just a little bit late getting in, so we may have some people chiming in. Just to go down some basics with this webinar, I just want to ask that everybody keep themselves muted. And if you have questions as the presenters are going along, please submit them in the chat box below. And then what they'll do is they'll go through the questions in the chat box at the end after the presentation. If you have any questions for me, I'm Kristen with the Effingham County Chamber of Commerce. I'm glad to have everybody here today that was able to make the call and excited to learn about the pre-employment testing. We've got Andy and John here from Apex Network, and I will be turning it over to them.
Perfect. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? This is John with Apex. Well, I guess you guys don't need to comment because everybody's muted.
I can hear you.
If you can't hear me, raise your hand and let me know. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint screen. And maybe Kristen, if you can tell me if you're able to see that.
I can see that, yes.
Perfect. Good deal. I just have a few slides I wanted to cover, and then we'll jump into Andy's portion of it. For those of you that I haven't met yet, just being in the community, my name is John Hettenhausen. I'm an occupational therapist. My background, started my 15th year with Apex here, spent quite a few years doing industry marketing, so I've possibly met some of you that are on the call today at different industry events and seminars and things we've hosted over the years. Wanted to give you a snapshot of our growth and our footprint. Most of you probably realize or maybe thought we were just in Effingham or had 1 or 2 clinics, but we're actually up to about 80 clinics now nationally in 14 states. And so I wanted to mention that just from a standpoint of we've really grown our systems and resources across the country. We've worked with a variety of industries and businesses, from manufacturing to trucking to automotive, food and poultry and pork industry. So we have a broad depth of experience, as Andy will talk about here a little bit later. For any companies that might have a national presence in Effingham and other areas, certainly can be a resource for you in those states too. Not to belabor that too long, more locally to you guys here, we have a snapshot of our regional Illinois and Missouri locations. Most relevant to you is going to be Effingham there in the top right-hand corner, and then Vandalia is probably the next closest outreach for you. We do some on-site therapy at Salem and Flora and Paris at some industries. But overall, this kind of gives you a snapshot of where we're located in the clinics that are nearby as a resource for you. That being said, wanted to talk about the different resources. I know today's conversation will be based around pre-employment testing. We'll venture into a little bit of the ergonomics and job analyses, but wanted to kind of just demonstrate the big array of services that we offer: physical therapy, certified hand therapy for hand injuries and cumulative trauma needs. We have an industrial rehab division, which Andy heads up, that encompasses work hardening, work conditioning, functional capacity evaluation. So get into some of that as well. We do sports rehab for athletes and weekend warriors. Some of our clinics have aquatic therapy locations, speech and OT. So really the full gamut of sprains, strains, and issues you might have from a musculoskeletal standpoint. And then lastly, the one thing not on this slide, but to mention, in these times of the COVID-19 outbreak and the pandemic, we are offering telehealth services. So we're doing telehealth evaluations as well as appointments that they're very easy to access. We schedule you, you have a link, you click on it. It's a secure portal that you can communicate with your therapist and do sessions. Obviously, some of it's not as hands-on and as intensive when you're not in the clinic, but there's a lot of things we can guide the patient through or the injured worker through on their exercise technique, the form that they're using, how they can adjust things and modify it, and then still just showing them those exercises. And we found it to be very helpful for them. They're getting that relief that they need when they still can't be in presence. But our clinics are open and we're treating. If people want to come in, we're using protective equipment. We have masks. We're constantly sterilizing and cleaning the mats and common contact surfaces, but then we have the visits as well. So quick little intro over the services and the information there. Happy to answer questions on that as we go along. But with that being said, then we'll kind of shift it to Andy and let him take control over the screen.
My name is Andy Vitale. I'm a occupational therapist by background. I've been with Apex for about 14 years, and my role with Apex is the director of our ACOMP program. So that's just an acronym for the program that basically covers our work comp side of the business, anything that ends up being employer related. So a lot of our prevention services like the pre-employment testing, the ergonomics, the on-site job analyses, some of the prevention stretching and stretch and flex programs that we do. So all those things kind of fall under my watch. John mentioned a few of these services. You can kind of read through those, but the main three that we'll kind of hit on a little bit today is, the importance of the job analysis to creating a good pre-employment test, and then obviously we'll hit on the employment testing, and then the prevention services. This is something that we do on site with companies. And, some of the stretching programs that we do pre-shift with companies, and then we kind of go in and do a little bit of, question and answer with the workers and see if there's some aches and pains that they're having. The Osha First Aid, OSHA allows us to do some of these things that are listed, like the ice, the heat, the massage, the taping, and some of the soft bracing without it becoming a recordable. So this is kind of a first report type thing where they have a claim of an ache, or they're just having some soreness. We can do some conservative treatment with them to try to alleviate that. And I think it's going to be important as companies start opening up to, people have been sitting around for weeks on end, they've not been doing their normal jobs, and then they come back and they're probably going to have some aches and pains. So I think these couple other prevention activities are going to be important as we get kind of companies back up and running. So as we go through this, I'll kind of go step by step on what I typically do for my job site analyses and how that plays into setting up the pre-employment test. So, what we like to do is come on site and see the job and see what the workers are doing and how they're doing it. One, for me, that gives me an idea of how to set up the test when we do it in the clinic. It allows us to kind of replicate the movements and the positions and the places that the worker's going. And then, also at that same time, we can kind of look and see if there's any ergonomic changes that maybe would, be a administrative change that we can make right away, just to make sure that, the workers that are doing the job currently are doing it as safely as possible. So this gets pretty in depth where we look at a lot of different factors. I've got a suitcase of things that I bring with me. So people kind of wonder if I'm moving in or, if I'm staying for a while, but, there's scales and tape measures and push pull gauges, obviously all the different PPE that we need at certain locations. So, a lot kind of goes into, just getting ready for the job analysis. So the reason we like to come on site too is because a lot of times when I get job information from companies, it's pretty generic. It might just have a 5 or 6 or 10 bullet points, and something might say the worker might lift up to 50 pounds. So when I look at that and try to figure out, okay, what does this worker do? It doesn't really tell me what items they're lifting, what the dimensions are. Does the box have handles, or the item that they're lifting have handles? And then are they just doing that once an hour, twice an hour, or is that something that happens 10 or 15 times, 100 times an hour? So those are the important things that are missing. And then with the non-material activities, like climbing ladders or bending or squatting, a lot of times the frequency of those activities is missing. Kind of, specific to ladders, is it a straight ladder? Is it an incline ladder? Are they climbing utility poles? What type of things are they doing? So Those are all important things that I look at and try to, add to what you have so that it is more specific. Like I said, when we look at things on the job site, I bring a scale out there and we can weigh, some of the lighter things, we can weigh the heavier things, we can figure out the average weight of things. What heights are they moving things from? So what is the origin of the box? Is it on a pallet? Is it on the floor? Is it on a 12-inch shelf? And then where does it get lifted to? So where does it, where's the destination at? Obviously, sometimes the dimensions of the item play a factor in that. So they can be, awkward items that are, 2 or 3 feet wide, or it can be a nice square box that's nice and easy to pick up. And then obviously the repetition of doing that plays into how we set up the test and how frequently they have to do that task. So when we create this job analysis, a couple of things it can use for is one, figuring out how to set up the lifting requirements for the pre-employment test. And then also what job activities do we need to simulate or replicate in the clinic? On the other end of that, I've had companies that use this to, if somebody wants to transfer into a different position, they may look at this and say, here's the job analysis. Here's what you have to do. Here's how many times you have to do it. So it gives that worker that wants to transfer into a position a more concrete idea of what that job entails. Also, sending this information to a doctor with a work comp, dealing with one of your workers with a work comp injury. It gives that doctor a concrete idea of like, what do they have to do? They're not just reading, oh, they have to lift 50 pounds. Well, they can't lift 50 pounds overhead. So, we can't send them back to work. Well, maybe that's not even a job demand. So, we all know that sometimes the truth can get exaggerated a little bit when our workers tell the doctors what they actually have to do on the job versus what the true requirements are. So this is a nice report that can be sent to the doctor and utilized to make sure that everybody's on the same page of what that worker has to do to get back to work. And then if there is any modified duty that the company can accommodate. So those are all good things for the doctor to know. This is an example of what our summary page looks like. So our first page of the report gives you, basically the demands of the job. So how much do they lift and carry? Is there any pushing and pulling involved? And then how frequently are they doing other activities, all those non-material handling activities? So this was a production line job. So you can see that they've got some lighter weights, those 5-pound weights that they're lifting repetitively through the shift and each hour. So there are these standardized, occasional, frequent, and constant repetition guides that can give the doctor some idea. And in the report, it is more specific. So that 50 pounds constantly, the 5 pounds constantly might get handled 70 or 80 times in an hour. So it'll give that information. The 45-pound pallets, those only get handled once or twice an hour. So all that information is pretty specific once you get into the actual body of the report. So using that information that we had on the previous slide, this is how we would create a test in the clinic. So, the candidate would be required to lift 5 pounds from 20 inches to 45 inches and back 20 times within 2 minutes. So, the important thing on production lines is we try to have them work in the clinic at the pace that they would work on the job. So, we don't want to make them work too fast. We don't want to make them work too slow. We want to try to replicate that cycle time that they have on the job. So that's important to consider as well. The heavier item, like that 45-pound pallet, that was basically moved from about knee height up to about waist height. So we're going to look at that a few times. And then that job also required some ladder climbing. So we would do, some sort of test to do the ladder climbing in the clinic. So, we would look and make sure they could use 3 points of contact, make sure that they were safe and not losing their balance as they were doing those activities. So a few quick statistics. This one's one that I see in a lot of different presentations, but always is still a little bit eye-opening. But 1 in every 10 American workers is not capable of performing the essential functions of the job safely. 75% of all the injury costs are incurred by that same percent. So, limiting that percent of people that are on the job site that can't do the job should greatly impact your work comp costs and your injury rates. Again, this is more, kind of gets to the point of if somebody can't do the job, it's not whether they're going to get injured, but when they get injured. So, there's only so many times you can lift a 50-pound box, unsafely and uncontrolled, and you're kind of heaving the box up before something gives out, either the back or the knee or the shoulder. So, these pretty recent, obviously, 2019, most job-related injuries and illnesses. I think when we look at all these bullet points here, that covers a pretty vast majority of the jobs that are out there. And, the age and gender of the workers, I think that was a pretty telling couple statistics that, over half of the workers who missed time from work were men. So probably not surprising there. And then workers under 25 had a higher rate of injury, although workers 55 to 64 were likely to miss more time off work. So those workers under 25, if they did have a lost time incident, they were off about a week. And then somebody who was in that 55 to 64 range, those were the people that were missing a couple weeks of work. So, things that you did when you were 25 and things you do when you're 55, you obviously are going to, heal up faster, when you're younger typically, and it's just going to take more time to recover. So, that was a pretty interesting statistic there. Incident frequency, this is, basically nationwide, but workers get injured, every 7 seconds on the job, 150 or 510 times an hour, 12,600 times a day. Those numbers just kind of keep going up at that 4.6 million injuries a year. And then the 104 million production days lost to work-related injuries. So obviously it can have a devastating effect on a company with a high injury rate. So some of the things that I kind of pulled out of this, obviously non-fatal injuries, but they classified things as overexertion, bodily reactions. Those are probably the two things that I see the most when they're lifting or lowering items. They're doing repetitive movements, or they drop something and try to catch it, and then all of a sudden they have a labrum tear in their shoulder. So, and then again, strains, sprains, and tears. The median lost work days for that was 11 days, and then just having soreness or pain was a median of 8 lost days. So those items, are things that we try to address, like I talked about earlier, with the stretch and flex programs, with the Osha First Aid. A lot of those musculoskeletal injuries are the things that we're looking at and trying to prevent from happening. So the pre-employment testing, just kind of in general, this is a functional screening, which helps to determine whether that person can safely do the essential functions of the job prior to them beginning work. So the big thing here is the post-offer pre-employment. Post-offer meaning you've hired or you've offered the job to that candidate, contingent on them passing, a drug screen, background check, and then you would add this functional testing to that list of things that they need to pass prior to beginning work. There are some other options, but this option gives you the ability to gather medical information, gather range of motion and strength measurements. So this definitely opens up the door to gathering as much information as possible prior to that person coming on site and starting work. Otherwise you're basically doing an agility test where we could test their lifting ability. We could see how they do some job activities, but we really can't collect any medical information at that point. And it really kind of limits your ability to know, what they can do. Again, so like we said at the beginning, it identifies the candidates that can't meet the essential functions of the position sought. The nice thing though is that if you do have an alternative position available, you like the person, they've got good, qualities that you want to bring them on board, you can offer them to go into a different position. So you still have all the background and baseline information on them. That just didn't meet the demands of the machine operator one job that they wanted, but there is a different assembly line that we could put them on. Again, one of the big things is gathering pre-employment, pre-existing musculoskeletal information. If they are healthy, that's great. It does give us at least a baseline of what they look like when they come on board to your company. Again, we're hiring healthy, capable workers. So in that situation, we should be seeing a reduction in workplace injuries. I've not had any issues, in depositions or talking to attorneys with these tests. The biggest thing is that, one big point is that you're testing all the employees that go into that same job classification. So you can't just pick and choose. So we can't say the 55 to 60-year-olds get tested, but the under 25 don't get tested. So we've got to test everybody that goes into that one job classification. You could test all the machine operator ones, but you don't have to test your janitors. You just have to make sure that you test that one group and you test everybody in that group. The other main part of this is that we're not just giving a general, weight that we need them to pass, or general, we're not just having them do a sit-up test or a push-up test. What they're doing is specific to the job. And those activities are there because, that job exists to meet those activities. So that's where we get by with the, the compliance with all the other guidelines. So in general, these tests, they take about 60 minutes. I'll go over each of these 4 bullet points a little more in depth, but they, basically will come in and do some paperwork. The therapist will review that. They'll go through the range of motion and strength testing. We'll do some lifting and carrying testing, and then the job specific. So, the way these tests work is that they go from, basically easiest to hardest. So easiest being filling out paperwork, answering some questions, to moving, checking some measurements, to then being more active and doing some lifting activities, and then the job activities. So when they do come in, nothing different than many other types of tests or types of medical situations they go into, but they'll fill out some demographic information, have them sign a consent form that allows us to test them, and then allows us to release that information back to you. And then the medical history is, again, in that post-offer situation, allows us to gather information about past issues. So have they had any past medical claims, personal or workers' compensation wise, and any other significant information that would help us to do that test safely. There's situations where somebody might have had a rotator cuff surgery, 6 months ago. A lot of times before we even test them, we'll make sure that they have clearance from their doctor. So we may need some kind of written information that says, yes, they've been released and I feel like they're safe to go out and try to get this job. Other injuries that are older, we'll kind of flag those, kind of yellow flag them and say, okay, we'll proceed with caution, but if we see something, we may have to stop. And I've got a pretty good example of that later on. So what do we do during that musculoskeletal evaluation? The biggest things we look at, their posture, is their, head forward, or their shoulders rounded? Do they have a sway in their back? How are they standing? Range of motion measurements of specific joints, especially those that have had previous injuries. So we'll go back and recheck some measurements there. There's some standard ways to look at, muscle strength, looking at joint integrity. So, is there any popping and cracking, any crepitus in there? Is there any laxity in that joint where it shifts around significantly more than the other side, or significantly more than normal? The other ones, we check reflexes, grip, pinch strength. Then we have some wrist and hand provocative tests that we do. for some of those manufacturing companies. So basically putting, the candidate's hands and wrists into a position that typically should not cause any adverse reaction. So any numbness, any tingling. If they do have some reaction, again, we kind of yellow flag that and then do a few more tests and kind of go from there. So like I said, we look at posture, make some comments on that. We look at their range of motion of, we kind of screen out every joint. So from the neck on down to the ankles. And then we have some specific measurements that we take of the back and the neck and then knees and shoulders as we need to. The grip gauge, the pinch gauge, and then the picture with the guy with his wrists together, that's one of the provocative tests that we do to, see if compressing that median nerve, if that causes any immediate, decrease in sensation, or if it changes their numbness and tingling, if they have any in their hands. So that can kind of give us a little bit of insight into if they have some warning signs of, some kind of underlying issue that may get exacerbated by coming on site and doing the activities at your job. So when we do the carrying and lifting activities, we kind of go by this explain, demonstrate, practice, and do guideline. So, I'll go through and I'll show them, here's how I would like you to do it. I'm going to, explain it. I'll show you a little sample. And then we let them start off with no weight or a very light weight so that I can assess what their body mechanics look like. And then from there, if we need to change things, we can make some adjustments without having a heavy load in that box. From that point, we progress them up gradually up to the job analysis weight that we figured out from their job site. And then from there, we're doing some ongoing body mechanics training. We're doing some ongoing assessment and giving them some feedback of, here's what you did this time compared to the other time. Let's try to fix that and make it a little bit safer. So real quick, just a few pictures. So this would be kind of your typical floor to waist lift. So fingers all the way down at the floor up to about waist level. And then waist to shoulder. No real significant description needed there. Overhead, and then carrying. So those are kind of your typical 4 main lifts that we would do. I do have a few companies that, we might have a floor to 50-inch lift or something like that. So what we typically do in those situations is we look at, can they get that item up to shoulder height? Or do we need to change that and make a standard lift activity or a test to make sure they can get that weight up to that 50 inches? And that's where the job specific testing comes in. That's where we're looking at what does the job require? What has to happen to get this job done on the job site? So we try to identify, 5 different items or activities that we need to see that person do. And then we make sure that they're safe doing those. Again, body mechanics instruction is important. We go through and make sure that they understand how to do it, what we're asking them to do. We'll show them how to do it. And the biggest thing is, some companies have a certain way they want certain tasks done, so we can give that explanation to them and make sure they can do it safely. Sometimes there's some, alterations in the way people do their lifting activities and how they place their feet. Those things are always, kind of reviewed with them just to make sure that they're okay doing it. So these job specific tests are basically the ones where, we kind of look at, what are they doing on the job and what can we replicate in the clinic? So, do they have to climb in and out of a truck cab or pull a heavy cart of, whatever item it is? We can do some shoveling, again, sledgehammering. So a lot of different simulation tasks that we can do in the clinic to, make sure that they can do the job that they're going out to do. We've got a couple trucking companies that we test for. We've got concrete chutes. We've got kegs. We have some, cases of soda and beer. So, it just really depends on what that job requires and what equipment we can hold in the clinic for that job. So the more specific we can make it, the better. If box that they lift doesn't have a handle on it, then that's what we want to do, is get that box and weight it down to the exact weight that's on the job, and then make sure they can do that safely. So in the end, going through all those things, we come up with two basic answers. They either met or did not meet the job demand. So obviously, if they met the demands, that they performed all the essential functions without any safety concerns. If they didn't meet the job demands, we'll send that back to you, give you a call, and let you know what items or what tasks they weren't able to meet. At that point, you can rescind the offer of employment at that point because they're not meeting the essential functions of the job. Or if you do have an alternative position they could go into, we could screen them for that and make sure that they could do that other job if there's anything different that wasn't tested initially. So doesn't mean you can't hire the person. It just means, you just need to proceed with caution and put them somewhere that their physical abilities are capable of meeting. So this is one that I was testing for a trucking company. And just a quick example of, kind of how you get some yellow flags that turn into red flags that, could be a huge issue for a company had this kind of gone through without any testing. So, we've got a 55-year-old male, smaller frame guy, 5'7", 152 pounds. His medical history, he told me he had a right humerus fracture in the past. So his upper arm had a fracture. Treatment was, he put it in the sling, let it heal up, went to some physical therapy. So I'm like, okay, that's fine. A little more concerning was when he told me it was painful that day. So I had him rated, from 0 to 10, just so I had an idea of what his pain level was like that day. And it was, a little more than just a, achy 1 or 2. It was more like a 3, 4, or 5. So we get into the musculoskeletal section, and his right shoulder range of motion, so the one that he had the fracture on, is significantly less than his left shoulder. His rotator cuff strength is significantly weaker than his left side. And his shoulder was significantly unstable. So I could basically take the head of his humerus and the shoulder and shift it up and down, in and out, forward and back. And it had a lot more play in it than what the other side had. So I knew something was going on. He probably, more than likely, had a rotator cuff tear before we even started any testing. So at this point, with that big of an issue, I was concerned that he could even do the test safely without getting hurt. So in this type of situation, we would stop the test, let the candidate know what's going on, and then we would refer that person out and say, look, you need to go to a doctor, get checked out. They need to sign this form that says you're safe to come back and do this type of testing. Essentially what happened is he didn't go get any medical clearance. The employer waited, for a little while to see if he would come back, and basically didn't. So they were able to rescind that offer of the employment. So, basically dodging a pretty big bullet where, that guy could have been working for a week or 2 weeks and, climbed on and off the truck a few times. And then all of a sudden came in and said, hey, my shoulder's been bothering me, or I slipped off the step and my shoulder, was holding on. My shoulder hurts now. And then all of a sudden they've got a, likely rotator cuff surgery that they bought. So, same company, kind of overall results in a year, they had about 17% of their candidates not be able to meet the job demand. So they had some pretty heavy lifting on one of their trucks. The other two were a little bit lighter. So, the heavier job was the heavier truck was the one that basically people were having trouble meeting those demands. If you want to go down a rabbit hole of injuries and costs and things like that, if you Google OSHA safety pays calculator, you can go in there and put in a strain or a sprain or carpal tunnel or a laceration, and it'll give you an estimate on what the direct costs per each incident are. So, if that company had, 5 or 10 injuries or candidates that didn't pass, those are 5 or 10 injuries that they probably avoided at some point during that year or the next year. And each one of those injuries costing about $32,000 in, medical costs, going to the doctor, getting x-rays, potentially going to therapy. So that stuff isn't cheap and it adds up quick. So like I said, if you're interested, that OSHA safety pays calculator is a pretty interesting little gadget. You can kind of, like I said, go down the rabbit hole in. So just kind of real quick in summary, just everything I kind of talked about, and kind of summarize here. So what can the candidate do? What are the essential functions of the job? And as those two things meet up, that gives you the idea that that person should be safe to come on site and do that job that they're applying for. Again, it's one of those things where it just kind of comes down to if everybody comes into the plant as a production line worker, maybe that's the only test that you have to create. But then if they start to transfer out of that into other more difficult jobs or heavier jobs, that may be another test that we need to create. So like I said, I've got companies that do 15 or 20 different tests, and I have some companies that have one that they rely on because that's pretty much what everybody comes into. And that's kind of the hardest job. So it just kind of depends, and everything can kind of be fit to what works in your job, in your plant, or your facility, or just kind of make things fit for you guys. So my direct number and information is here. I'm going to try. I don't know what happened, but I'm having a hard time pulling up the actual visual, so I'm not seeing the chat thing again. So if I can get back to that, I didn't see if there was any questions. So that's what I have on my end as far as the presentation goes.
Andy, I'm going to go ahead and steal the screen back from you. And then I think what we could do here is just ask if anybody's got some questions to go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and let us know. Anybody got anything? Okay. Well, that was a great presentation. Oh, I'm sorry. Does somebody have something? Okay, guess not.
Nope.
That was a fantastic presentation. I definitely learned a lot. I hope everybody else did as well. Very, very eye-opening about how important all that stuff is these days, as far as making sure that you get qualified employees that also can physically do the jobs that they're being asked to prevent injury and additional expense and liability to the company. So thank you so much for that. That was tremendous. If there are no other questions, then we can go ahead and jump off here. I am so grateful for everybody who joined us today. We did record this presentation. It will be available through our advocate email, which comes out tomorrow morning at 8:45 a.m. So if you want to revisit, you certainly can. And also get in touch with us here at the Chamber if you have any questions or need to get to Andy or John that we heard from today, and we'll make sure we make those connections. So thank you everybody for attending, and we hope to talk to you all soon.
Perfect. Thank you, Kristen, for inviting us. And I know this was a fairly technical talk, but if there's other things we can talk about, injury prevention, shoulder injuries, back injuries, decreasing pain, things like that you hear about through the Chamber, I'm certainly glad to put other topics together as well.
Absolutely. And those that are in attendance, if you have some ideas, if there's some information that maybe wasn't covered in this one that you'd like to learn about, definitely get in touch with us and we'll get it put together.
Thanks
okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.